nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prana nata pada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilasujjitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payurasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madanamohano Adadanastrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimadrupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvabhara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangstu Matsvanta Durdanta Hai Churastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Atupada Padme Bhaktirya Nikilargta Varga Jananish Ya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajaloka Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namaha Ya Ramya Nikilagha Sangha Shamani Shrutra Tritim Sangata Ya Swadhyai Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again, today we continue our discussion of Padyavali, and we'll proceed further into this prakaran on utkanta, longing. So, in the previous verses, we heard a verse of Madhavendra Puri, as well as others expressing varieties of longing for Krishna, longing for the sight of him, and so forth. So today, we'll hear more of the same. And let me just see, the file is not there. I have it here that it went up.
It's there.
Okay. switch out there. Okay. Then, alright, so I'm starting from verse 102. Next, the compiler cites a verse wherein a bhakta describes his longing for Sri Krishna and its effect in the form of desirelessness for any otherwise often desired object. Alaṁ tridiva-vārtayā kimiti sārvabhauma-śriyā vidūratara-vartinī bhavatu mokṣa-lakṣmīr api Kalinda girinandini tatani kunja-punjodare mano harati kevalaṁ nava-tamāla-nīlaṁ mahaḥ. Enough with talk of Svarga. What is the use of the majesty of rule over the entire earth? Let even the treasure of moksha remain further afar. Inside the array of arbors, along the bank of the daughter of Mount Kalinda, the light, deep blue like a young tamal, captivates my mind completely. I'll read it one more time. Enough with talk of Svarga. What is the use of the majesty of rule over the entire earth? Let even the treasure of moksha remain further afar. Inside the array of arbors along the bank of the daughter of Mount Kalinda, the light, deep blue like a young tamal, captivates my mind completely. The author expresses that he is desirous neither of full facility for enjoyment in his life on earth, nor such in a prospective future life in Svarga, nor even moksha, even though these are highly desired by others. Why does he have no such desire? Quote, the light, deep blue like a young tamal, that is, Sri Krishna, whose swarthy complexion resembles the tone of the bark of a young tamal tree, captivates my mind completely. Meaning, the author feels such strong longing for Sri Krishna that no desire for any other object can find any place in his mind. And to convey how he perceives Sri Krishna, that is, the particular Leela of Sri Krishna that captivates his mind, he says, inside the array of arbors, along the bank of the daughter of Mount Kalinda. The implied remainder being, Sri Krishna is present there for the sake of play with Sri Radha and her Sakhis. Thus, it is Sri Krishna in the midst of his Madhura Rasa Leela that the author longs for. So what's also noteworthy in this regard, both the specificity of the object of desire as well as the effect of the desire. So what is the measure of utkanta, or the measure of the mind being intensely desirous of one object? That the mind loses its desire for other objects. In other words, when one desire really becomes intense, then it overrides, it overpowers, it dismisses other desires. So this is also a matter of introspection, as the eligibility for the path of Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti is said to be intense desire, or lobh, as it was said earlier here in the Padyavali, tatra lolyam api mulyam akalam, that Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavita Mati, that the state of the mind being steeped in Krishna Bhakti Rasa is attainable only by intense desire. In other words, what absorbs the mind? Desire. So the state of the mind fully absorbed in Krishna Bhakti, how does that come about? Intense desirousness for that object. that's required in order for that state of absorption to come about. So when that state of absorption comes about, that intense desire is present, and the secondary effect of that intense desire is that the mind becomes non-desirous or disinterested towards other possible objects of desire. So here, bhukti and all its varieties, mukti, these are no longer the object in the mind of the speaker because of the intensity of his desire for Krishna. So then Krishna is charmingly described not as a person, but as a light, deep blue like a young tamal. So, as though, inside an array of arbors, or as though off in the enchanted forest, there's a glimmering or a luster to be perceived there. This wondrous, all-attractive figure of Krishna in the midst of his Leela, this has captivated the mind of the poet, of the Bhakta. So thus the verse is expressive of utkanta, or longing. So the prakaran here is the prakaran on longing, so the verse conveys longing because he's saying, I don't desire these other things, my mind has been captivated by Krishna. In other words, my mind is filled with longing for Krishna. Next, the compiler cites a verse wherein longing is expressed for Sri Krishna as he trysts with gopis in the seclusion of an arbor in Vrindavan. Avalokitam, anumoditam, āliṅgitam, aṅganābhir, anurāgaiḥ, adhivṛndāvana-kuñjaṁ, marakata-puñjaṁ, namasyāmaḥ. When will we offer adoration to the array of emeralds in an arbor in Vrindavan, beheld, delighted, and embraced by shapely women with anurag? So there's some alliteration going here in the verse, all the words starting with A. Avalokitam, anumoditam, āliṅgitam, anurāgaiḥ, adhivṛndāvana. He's rolling it out like that. So there's some charm in the way it's expressed. So the commentator states that a mention of, quote, when is to be supplied in the verse, because it otherwise does not convey a sense of longing. In other words, if the verse is read flatly, it just says, I give obeisance to Krishna who is X, Y, and Z, which is perfectly fine. But since this is being cited here in the prakaran on longing, you would expect that there be some expression of longing in the verse. So the commentator is saying that we have to assume that the implied sense is that there's a when will I do this, which thus conveys a sense of longing. So this verse harkens back to the celebrated description in Srimad Bhagavatam of Sri Krishna's appearance amid the gopis upon his return to their midst on the bank of the Yamuna after his disappearance for some time from the sight of their rasa dancing. Oh, I'm missing the footnote here. Okay, I'll have to add that in. So he says, Bhagavan, the son of Devaki, shined brightly there with them, like an excellent emerald in the midst of golden ornaments. So a fine jewel, like an emerald or a sapphire, is beautiful on its own, but when it's arrayed with gold around it, it becomes even more excellent or more beautiful in its appearance. So here, Krishna is embraced by the gopis, is compared to an emerald in the midst of gold. But one question may arise here: why an emerald? Although the word marakata is well known to denote specifically an emerald and not a blue sapphire, Sri Samipad and other commentators gloss the word marakata in this verse from Srimad Bhagavatam as a blue sapphire, or nīla-mani. Presumably because Sri Krishna's complexion is well known to appear deep bluish rather than dark greenish. So an emerald is greenish, Krishna is known to be more bluish, so you would expect him to be described here like a nīla-mani, more so than a marakata. In other words, more like a blue sapphire than an emerald. So the question would arise, why is he being described here like an emerald? So Samipad is saying, emerald just means sapphire. Sri Jivapad and Sri Chakravartipad accept this point of view. In other words, they repeat that in their commentaries, but also alternately explain, as Sri Sanatan Pad does as well, that although Sri Krishna's complexion is indeed alike in hue to a blue sapphire and not an emerald, he is nevertheless described in this verse as shining brightly, specifically like an excellent emerald, because the blueness of his complexion blends with the goldness of the gopis' complexion when he is encircled by them at the moment of his return to their midst. And his complexion thus appears greenish like an emerald rather than blue like a sapphire at that time. So, a little color theory here. When you mix blue and yellow, what do you get? Green. So he's taking it that Krishna's bluest complexion and the gopis' golden complexion, when the light of these two complexions come together, then it casts a green sheen. So it's as though for Krishna to be described as green here means that his blueness is being partially blended with the goldness of the gopis, and thus he looks greenish. So if we take this perspective this perspective and explanation would work well with our verse under discussion, because in this verse that we're discussing now, Krishna is again compared to an emerald, and he's again being described as being embraced by the gopis. So, applying this perspective, the description in the verse under discussion of Sri Krishna as a, quote, array of emeralds, marakata-puñjaṁ, who has been, quote, embraced by shapely, women with anurāgaiḥ, can be understood to refer to Sri Krishna by way of alluding to the glimmering appearance of his various bodily features that resemble an array of emeralds, by virtue of their sapphire blue hue, blending its sheen together with the sheen of the golden hue of the bodies of the gopis embracing him. The commentator also states that, quote, delighted, anumoditam, can be understood to mean invited, in which case the sense is that Sri Krishna is beheld by the gopis with glances that invite him to an arbor in Vrindavan, so that they can fulfill their cherished desires. And once he arrives there in response to their invitation, he is embraced by them by virtue of his being their dearest beloved. So in the verse, as it says, avalokitam, anumoditam, āliṅgitam, he's taking it that he's glanced at, or he's beheld, means he's invited, or he's sent a signal through a glance. So he's glanced at, and by being glanced at, he's thus by being avalokita, he's thus anumodita, or he's thus invited or beckoned. And upon being beckoned, he's then āliṅgita, embraced. So he takes it in this way. That just by these string of statements, then actually a lila, or an unfolding of events, is implied. So when the author is thus saying, when will we offer adoration to the array of emeralds in an arbor in Vrindavan, beheld, delighted, and embraced? Then the implication can be, when may I also be there and assist in this lila? When may I also render some service in the midst of this, and thus show adoration? Okay, next one. Next, the compiler cites a verse of Sri Madhavendra Puripad, wherein he expresses his longing to behold Sri Krishna. Karadrakshami nandasya bhalakam nīpa-mālakam bhalakam sarva-sattvānāṁ lasat-tilaka-bhālakam. So again, this verse has some alliteration with the bhalakam, malakam, palakam, bhalakam going through the verse. So by this manner he says, when shall I behold Nanda's boy, the protector of all beings, with a garland of nipa flowers around his neck and tilak shining on his forehead? So there's some implied sense that the protector of all beings, of all existent entities, this is usually conceived of as Bhagavan or Vishnu. So to say that he who is that protector of all beings is in essence this youth of Nanda, who appears charming with a bright forehead, with tilak, with a nipa flower garland. This is creating a sense of accessibility, charm, intimacy, and therewith an expression of longing. Now, I've left the word nipa, or the nipa flower, untranslated, and now I'll explain why. In regard to a verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, in which the gopis address both nipa and kadamba trees, Sri Samipad comments that the nipa and kadamba are two different subspecies of the same species of tree. So the problem here is that usually the words nipa and kadamba are described as synonyms for the same tree. So then you have this one case in Bhagavatam where the gopis, this is in the Rasa Lila, when they're in this state of Prem Vilas Vaichitra, and they're wandering in the forest and so absorbed in thought of Krishna that they're actually acting as if they are Krishna. And then they're speaking to the deer and speaking to the trees, asking, have you seen Krishna? Where can we find him? So when they address the trees, it mentions that they speak to both nipa and kadamba trees. So normally these two words are used to refer to, or thought to be, synonyms for the same type of tree. But if they're both used side by side, it implies that they're not two names for the same tree, but they're actually two different trees. So Samipad takes it that they're the same species, but they're two different subspecies, and thus there's a reason why, or they might be used as synonymous, and how they can also be used side by side. But then you might wonder, well then, what's the difference between them? What's the specification, what's the characteristic that you can tell them apart? So Sri Sanatan Pad says, the two differ on the basis of color and other features. So, a little detail, but not a lot. Sri Jivapad, referring to the Vishwa Prakasha dictionary, states that the nipa is the tree known as the, quote, Duli Kadamba, or the pollen Kadamba, and that it produces large flowers that contain a large amount of pollen. He doesn't say anything, however, about the kadamba that is distinct from this nipa. So he explains that there's a nipa and there's a kadamba, and the nipa is the duli kadamba. So then you might wonder, well then what's the kadamba if the nipa is a duli kadamba? Sri Chakravartipad states that the nipa is the duli kadamba, which produces large flowers, and that the kadamba mentioned in this verse is a tree with small, highly fragrant flowers. Okay, so the nipa has big flowers that are full of pollen, and the kadamba has small flowers which are fragrant. So that's as much as we can get from our commentators. So I did a little more research, and this is what I found. According to an article published in the International Journal of Ayurveda and Pharma Research, and just in case anyone's wondering why are we going into so much detail about these plants, there's no great Russic significance to this. I just like these kind of things. The beauty of Vrindavan, to have some kind of image of it through the plants, I find that endearing. So here we go. According to an article published in the International Journal of Ayurveda and Pharma Research, there are 3 different types of kadamba mentioned in Ayurvedic texts, such as the Charaka Samhita, Shrushruta Samhita, and Ashtanga Hridayam. Number 1, the tree which is most commonly known as kadamba, and also known as Duli kadamba and Raja kadamba, is botanically classified as this. Okay, so in other words, the tree that's most commonly called kadamba is the tree that the commentators have identified as not the kadamba but the nipa. So this is, why it's a little important. The tree which is most commonly known as nipa, and also known as giri kadamba, mahaḥ kadamba, harindu, and haldu, is botanically classified as Adina cardifolia. So in other words, what this shows is that in popular speech, the common way that these are spoken of is reversed to the way the commentators have explained them. And the tree which is most commonly known as Dhara kadamba, and also known as true kadamba and Keli kadamba, is botanically classified as Maitragya parviflora. According to modern scientific observational knowledge, it is this 3rd kadamba, the Dhara kadamba, that is most commonly observable in the Braj region still today. Whereas the Duli kadamba is seldom seen there, yet commonly found in the less arid northeast region of the subcontinent. Thus, the flower which the author, who is known to have repeatedly visited the Braj area in the 16th century, had in mind when he speaks of Sri Krishna wearing a garland of nipa flowers, may have been the Dhara kadamba, but it's difficult to say. So here in Bengal, you can commonly find the Duli kadamba, what Jiva Goswami is calling the nipa. There's one that grows right in front of our kuti here. It flowers sometimes in the year. So that you can find fairly commonly in Bengal, and generally speaking of the 3, it's perhaps the most beautiful. So that, according to the commentators, is what is called the nipa. But as far as the kadamba that's actually found in the Braj area, the most commonly found one is what is called this true kadamba, or this other category of kadamba. So when Madhavendra Puri is writing about a nipa, is he writing about the kadambas that he might have seen when he visited Vrindavan? Is he writing about the kadambas that he might have seen when he was in West Bengal? Was he writing about both? It doesn't really matter, but this much we can conjecture about what it might be. The compiler, throughout his various compositions, speaks of Sri Krishna wearing tilak of a variety of types. So now a little more specificity here. The verse says he's wearing a nipa flower garland, so it might be these large, fragrant Duli Kadamba flowers. It might be this somewhat similarly looking true Kadamba flowers. And also tilak on his forehead. So now what kind of tilak is that? How much can we understand? So if we look in Rupa Goswami's writing, the compiler throughout his various compositions speaks of Sri Krishna wearing tilak of a variety of types, such as sandalwood, red ochre, kumkum, and gorochana. So in other words, Rupa Goswami doesn't say that Krishna only wears one kind of tilak. He describes Krishna wearing tilak of various colors. Gorochana is bright yellow, a bit like what we call gopi chandan. Kumkum, red ochre, or obviously red. Sandalwood is, a bit more in the brown category. So what color was this bright tilak? It might have been yellow, it might have been red, it might have been a bit more of a beige. And in all cases, Adena emphasizes that Sri Krishna's tilak appears bright and beautiful. Thus, the tilak that the author had in mind as he wrote the verses under discussion may have been any or all of these types. So whether in his mind's eye he was seeing Krishna wearing one particular color of tilak, or maybe in times envisioned him in various ways, who can say? In any case, nipa flowers, bright tilak, beautiful Krishna. The author is saying, Madhavendra Puri is saying, when shall I behold him? All right, so next, the compiler cites a verse of his own that conveys his longing for Sri Krishna. So now we have Rupa Goswami including a verse of his own. Adhivṛndāvana-kuñjaṁ mihira duhitu sangamohite muhur brahmam charita laharim gokulapate lapanuchayruchay nayana payasam ve nibiraham karishe sutkantam nibiramupasekam vitapinam. As I roam continuously throughout the forest of Brinda, honored by the daughter of the sun's companionship, and fervently bawl a wave of the deeds of the Lord of Gokula, when will I, filled with longing, heavily sprinkle the trees with streams of tears from my eyes? So a similar vein to the verse we discussed earlier in the Shikshastakam, Sriman Mahaprabhu saying, when will tears shower from my eyes? When will my voice stutter? And so on. So he's saying, I'll read it one more time. As I roam continuously throughout the forest of Brinda, honored by the daughter of the sun's companionship, and fervently bawl the wave of the deeds of the Lord of Gokula, when will I, filled with longing, heavily sprinkle the trees with streams of tears from my eyes? The description of Vrindavan being, quote, honored by the daughter of the suns, that is the Yamuna's companionship, can also be understood to convey that Vrindavan appears most splendid by virtue of the Yamuna's winding around it. So by saying that Vrindavan is honored by the Yamuna's company, it's as though to envision, or as though to invite the reader to envision the presence of the Yamuna around the perimeter of the Vrindavan forest specifically. And in the map of today, you see that the Yamuna comes in and around Vrindavan it comes down on the north side and then goes around the east and circles it like this. And in the vision of Kaviraj Goswami and the Govinda Lilamrita, it actually breaks into two and circles around the whole forest of Vrindavan on both sides. So by saying honored by Yamuna's companionship, it's as though the Yamuna is like holding Vrindavan like this, so to speak, like in her cupped palms, or like embracing and surrounding the Yamuna. But to say honoring, you could say with adoration or with, great love, she's accompanying and honoring Vrindavan. So there, in the midst of that Vrindavan, he's expressing his longing. So he says, the author's metaphoric description of Sri Krishna's deeds as a wave suggests that by immersing oneself in them, one automatically becomes freed from the three miseries of material existence. And we can add that he's evoking this imagery of the Yamuna. So what is the Yamuna doing? Flowing with what? Waves. So in this Vrindavan that's surrounded by the flowing waves of the Yamuna, then he's saying, when will I bawl a wave? So by bawl I mean cry, or the way that he, that's just not me saying it, that's just my translation, but the word lapan, or lup, is a dhatu, which can mean to wail, or to weep, or to bawl. So uchoyer lapan means to cry loudly, or fervently. So as the Yamuna is flowing around Vrindavan with her waves, then Rupa Goswami walking in the midst, or, as he's saying, roaming continuously. So as the Yamuna is continuously flowing around Vrindavan, he is continuously roaming about Vrindavan, and he is also emitting this wave, so to speak. But the wave that he's emitting is his weeping, or his, tearful, emotional rendition, remembrance and expression of some of Krishna's Leela. So it's as if his remembrance and his singing and sort of crying and singing together, that this is like another wave passing through and enriching the atmosphere of Vrindavan. So he's saying, when will I roam about continuously as the Yamuna is circling around or moving around Vrindavan similarly, and when will I cry out fervently these Leelas of Krishna? So he says, when will I, filled with longing, heavily sprinkle the trees with streams of tears from my eyes? So as the mist comes in off the Yamuna and blows upon the trees of Vrindavan, then this wave that he is emitting, then the droplets of that will also scatter or splash upon the trees. So the commentator also considers that the author describing himself as, quote, filled with longing, alludes to his reflecting as he roams about Vrindavan. Quote, still now, Sri Krishna does not bestow his grace upon me. So that is to say, he's longing for the sight of Krishna, as we hear in the definition of bhava bhakti, that there is chitta-mot-srinyata, or this melting of the heart, and with ruchi bis. And these ruchis, or these desires, are prapti-abhilash, so hard-abhilash, to attain Krishna, to see Krishna, to receive his affection. So here Rupa Goswami is expressing longing. It's taken to mean that he's in a state of wanting this vision of Krishna, of feeling as though Krishna hasn't yet granted him his darshan. The author being filled with longing can alternately be considered an outcome of numerous different subjects of inner reflection. So that's the way the commentator takes it, but it can be seen in other ways. such as one of eagerness to behold Radha and Krishna wherever they are in Vraja, as Srinivasacharya describes the author and his companions in Shadgoshamiyastakam. So we similarly see Rupa Goswami and the other Goswamis described in a similar manner like this. He Radhe Vrajadevi ke chalalite he nandasuno kuta Shri Govardhana kalpa parapatale kalindi vanye kuta Goshanta viti sarvato brajapure kaidhair mahabhibalo Bande rupa sanatano raghuyugo Shri Jiva Gopalako. O Radha Brajadevika, O Lalita, O son of Nanda, where are you? At the base of a desire tree near Govardhan? In the grove beside the Yamuna? Where are you? Calling out in this way everywhere throughout the abode of Braja, completely overwhelmed by lamentations. I offer obeisance to they who are so, Rupa, Sanatan, the two Raghus, Sri Jiva and Gopal. So in this verse, Rupa Goswami is describing or expressing himself in a way that's akin to how Srinivasacharya has described him in this verse. In this verse, he speaks of him as, calling out, where are you? In this verse itself, Rupa Goswami is saying as though he's singing and crying out some description in remembrance of some of Krishna's Leela. And we can also say, more broadly, the author's longing and other activities described in this verse can be seen as an enactment of the final type of sadhana prescribed in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, for Gopakumar to at last attain his Ishtadevata Sri Krishna in Braja, as was discussed in regard to humility, there's a typo, earlier in the commentary on the third verse of Srimad Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So when Gopakumar goes through his whole journey, we've discussed this earlier, but certainly no harm in revisiting it. When Gopakumar goes through his whole journey, he finally comes to Dwaraka. He meets with Uddhava and Narada. They realize he's not fit for Dwaraka. He has to reach Braj. So finally they discuss in secret what he can finally do. What is the final sadhana he can do that will ensure that he at last reaches Braja? And so they deliberate and then decide he should go to Braj on earth and he should do as is described in these verses. So they say, Tadvai tasya priya kridavana bhumo sadaraha nivam sang tanuyarivam sampadye tachirad dhruvam. Always residing in seclusion in the land of his dear play forests, namely Braja. One should develop that is, one should expand that prema through engagement in sadhana. So in this context, Sanatana Goswami, in a few places in the Bhagavatamrita, he speaks of prema as the means to attain Krishna, as a sadhana, rather than as the sadhya, as we hear in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and the Sandarbhas. So no contradiction between their viewpoints, just a different choice of words. So when Sanatana Goswami speaks this way, what it amounts to is engaging in what Rupa Goswami has technically defined as sadhana bhakti. And Sanatana Goswami refers to this adage that the characteristics of a siddha are the sadhana of a sadhaka. So that prema is the characteristic of a siddha, and that is, so to speak, the sadhana of a sadhaka, meaning that is the basis, or their means of approach is derived from that. So, in other words, go to Braj, stay in seclusion, and culture this prem bhakti. And how so? Then in a later verse he says the following: Tat tridiva-vārtayā dainyam tat premapi sarva-sattvānāṁ tat tat shunyam ivaranyam saridgiryadi pashyatam sarahaharavakranta vadananam tatahridi mahasantapadagdanam sapriyam parimrigyatam. There in Braja, humility and prema always arise within the sadhus who see the forests such as Vrindavan, waters such as the Yamuna, mountains such as Govardhan, and so forth, as though vacant. Those sadhus whose mouths are filled with cries of ha, ha, and who are burned by intense sorrow at heart as they search for their beloved Sri Krishna. So this verse is strikingly similar to the verse of Rupa Goswami himself. So the final sadhana taught in the Bhagavatamrita, and then this verse of Rupa Goswami autobiographically describing how he expresses his longing, and longing being the eligibility for the path of Raganuga Bhakti. So one with longing, then engaging in some sadhana bhakti, as Rupa Goswami describes it, is spot on exact what the Bhagavatamrita ultimately describes as the sadhana by which Gopakumar achieved entrance into Braj. So here Rupa Goswami is saying, when will I wander about Vrindavan, singing of some lila, longing, as the commentator took it, feeling as though I haven't seen you and begging to do so. So similarly, Sanatana Goswami is here writing that the sadhus see Vrindavan and the Yamuna and the Govardhan as though vacant, and they're crying out, and their hearts are filled with humility, and they're as though searching for Krishna. So this is then applied by Gopakumar, and he describes it as follows. Tam naradiyam manusritya shiksham Shri Krishna namani nija priyani sankirtayam susvaramatra lilas tasya pragayan anuchintayangscha tadiya lilastala jatametat vilokayan bhavadashe gatuye tayo suchitte karanena lajje katam parasmin katayan yaham te. Following that instruction of Narada, here in Braja melodiously chanting names of Sri Krishna dear to myself, singing aloud of his, and meditating upon his leelas, and beholding the sights of his leelas, this bhava and state which arose in me, I feel embarrassed just by thinking of them within my own heart. That is, I became so overwhelmed. How can I describe them to someone else? So Gopakumar followed that instruction. So what did he ultimately do? He went to Braja and he chanted the name melodiously. He sang of and meditated upon Krishna's leelas, and he went out about the various sites where these leelas took place as he did so. So what is Rupa Goswami saying here? He's wandering about Vrindavan, he's singing out fervently of these leelas of Krishna. He's filled with longing, and he's seeing these forests as though empty, as though he hasn't been blessed with a vision of Krishna. So, another instance where, such nice, if you will, for lack of a better word, interplay between the works of Rupa and Sanatan. Reading one enriches our appreciation of the other, and we see how aligned they were in so many ways. So, I'll read one more time this verse of Rupa Goswami, and then we'll move on. As I roam and roam continuously throughout the forest of Brinda, honored by the daughter of the sun's companionship, and fervently bawl a wave of the deeds of the Lord of Gokula, when will I, filled with longing, heavily sprinkle the trees with streams of tears from my eyes. Alright, I think we've got time for one more. Next, the compiler cites another verse of his own that conveys his longing to hear the sound of Sri Krishna's flute. Durarohe Lakshmi vati bhagavati namapipiram tadhana dhamile natati kataniyeyo panishadam rutirvangshi janma driti madurima sa maduripo akasmad asmakam shruti shikaramārukshati kada. When will that sound born of Madhuripu's flute, and bearing such sweetness, which places its feet and dances atop even the difficult to ascend, firm and beautiful chignons of the goddesses of the Upanishads, suddenly ascend upon the crests of our ears. The Upanishads are widely regarded as the foremost of all the Shrutis, that is, the Shastras which were originally heard, or Shruta. They are thus considered to be sounds, and moreover to be the most sacred, profound, and ultimately bliss-producing of all sounds. In this verse, the author compares the Upanishads to goddesses who wear beautiful, firmly bound chignons, that is, braided and highly ornamented hairdressings, to evoke an image of their being highly exalted and endowed with majestic beauty. He further describes them as, quote, difficult to ascend, to convey that just as there is almost nothing in existence that is so honorable that even finely dressed goddesses would feel the need to honor it by placing it atop their highly ornamented chignons, so the Upanishads are widely regarded as the foremost of all Shastras, which do not figuratively bow their heads to any others, and rather are highly revered by all. Moreover, their being, quote, difficult to ascend, further suggests that they are not easy to understand, and the path of upasana they teach is not easy to succeed at. Still, the sound of Sri Krishna's flute bears such magnificent spiritual sweetness that it places its feet atop the highly ornamented chignons of the bowed heads of these Upanishad goddesses and dances there. That is, it both shows its utter superiority to the Upanishads, and so also delights all with its charm. The resonance, that is implied meaning of the verse, is that the sound of Sri Krishna's flute can bestow even the fifth ultimate purushartha, namely Sri Krishna Prem, which is superior even to the mukti that can be attained by worshipping the goddesses of the Upanishads, that is, by learning and practicing the Upanishad taught in the Upanishads. Thus, out of great longing to hear that sound of Sri Krishna's flute, the author wonders, when will that sound ascend upon the crests of our ears? The implied sense being that he compares the blessed experience of hearing Sri Krishna's flute to the sound thereof being honorably received atop the highest point of the ears and then graciously dancing there. That is, expressing its charm in full. So, I'll leave it at that for today. These beautiful expressions of longing, verses of Rupa Goswami, Madhavendra Puri, and other poets. So as Radhakrishna Das Goswami explains in his Dashloki Bhashya, the purpose of all varieties of sadhana is on the path of Raganuga Bhakti is to engender lobha or intense desire for the bhav of Brajas Padikaras within the heart of the sadhaka. And it's ghara lolyaika-labdhya in the words of Kaviraj Goswami, that is prema seva, the prayojana, the ultimate goal of the path is attainable only by intense lolya, ghara lolyaika-labdhya. And as was said earlier, here in the Padyavali, tatra lolyam api mulyam akalam. The price is lolya alone. So this section is very important because here great parikaras, great bhaktas of Bhagavan are expressing that very precious substance called longing for Sri Krishna. So this is the great object, so to speak, to be sought by the sadhaka, because once this is had, then the effect of this, is sure to lead to the attainment of the ultimate desired thing. So as we've also discussed earlier in regard to the principle of the tat kratu nyaya, that one needs only to form a resolve or a specific intention, and that to desire is to have. In other words, when one really desires something, one will inevitably get it. So the challenge is not so much to get the thing, but to reach the state of one pointedly and intensely wanting it. So to hear these expressions of that very precious state of mind, of being intensely desirous, this is deeply nourishing to the installation, if you will, of a samskara that gives rise to such desire within another. So thus, we take our time to hear these beautiful expressions. So I'll stop here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or any other feedback, please feel free to share. Yes?
Pranam again. Which was the reference source verse of when Krishna is described as being greenish because of contact with gopis? What's the source verse?
It's given there in the file, Bhagavatam 10:30, 33:6 or something? Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, lastly, you said, you just mentioned that it's not about the obtaining, but actually the eagerness to obtain. Is that a pedantic statement? Sorry to say that, but...
Yeah, sure. As per the commentary on the Dashloki, that's how he explains it.
Oh, okay. I see. Okay. Thank you.
All right, well, we can conclude here for today, and it's befitting that this discussion of Utkanta comes just after the verse in the previous Prakaran of Mahaprabhu saying, Nadhanam, Najanam, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this, I want only ahituki bhakti. So having expressed that desirelessness of other things, then the corollary of that is to want only this and to long for it, to feel both a desire in general and a sense of specific covetousness, because it's that specific state of longing that really absorbs the mind. And as it is also said in the Sindhu, that sadhana bhinivesh, there's two ways by which bhava bhakti is reached. One is by sadhana bhinivesh, or absorption in sadhana, and the rare exception to that is someone who achieves it by grace, never having done any sadhana. So that doesn't apply to hardly anybody, because anyone who's engaged in general discourse and so on is already engaging in some sadhana. So the path, as far as it's to be followed is to pursue the state of abhinivesh, or absorption in these acts of bhakti, absorption in sadhana. And absorption comes about by virtue of the intensity of desire. So, from statements of Rupa Goswami himself, from these other commentaries related to statements he's made or that Kaviraj Goswami's made, then from different angles we can arrive at this conclusion, that we want to reach that state of being singularly and acutely desirous. So the sadhana we perform, the things that we hear, the things that we chant, our sadhana should be attuned such that it is nourishing the increase of that. As in general, sadhana can be characterized as that the purpose of which is deepening the bhakti vasana or the bhakti samskar. Then, that's the chassis, if you will, on which desire or lobe runs. In other words, by deepening the samskara, by deepening the vasana, then there can be that intensity of desire. From that intensity of desire can come that intensity of absorption, and from that intensity of absorption can come the experience and the reception of the grace, can evoke that grace, so to speak, in the heart of Sri Krishna. So this is the beautiful, blessed path that has been laid out for us by Sri Rup Sanatan, and is enriched by so many of these poetic expressions. So we'll verge further into this in the coming discussions. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Thank you, Baba. Thank you.